Hello and welcome to episode 51 of The Garden Log with me, Ben Dark. I am a gardener and this is the audio diary of my week gardening. For those of you who are new to The Garden Log, you can use the log however you like. You might draw some inspiration from it. You might be reminded of a job that you didn't get round to during the week. You might not actually listen to the words at all, just have it there in the background as a reminder that there is someone out there in the fields. I don't know, who am I to say how it should be consumed? This week I am pruning and tying in climbing roses. A wonderfully enjoyable horticultural task, like the apple pruning from last week, but with far less pressure. Roses are an opportunity to have some fun with your string and your secateurs. I'm also doing some unseasonable bulb planting. Some bulb planting completely the wrong time exposes me as a very poor gardener. I'm thinking about snowdrops. I'm wishing for a certain type of snowdrop that I'm not sure exists. I am also fixing some verges and carrying out the little bits and pieces that keeps a professional gardener going through the winter. If you listen closely, you might hear the rain beating against the windows of my study. I recorded this on one of those very wet Sunday afternoons that are built for staring out at the plants in your garden through layers and layers of water as they are lashed by gusts and rain. I really do enjoy a stormy, wet Sunday. But rain or otherwise, let's get on and listen to The Week in Gardening. Welcome to The Week in Gardening, a cold week towards the end of January 2019, the kind of week that reminds the gardener that there is still an awful lot of winter left to go through, the kind of week that makes one look at one's boots as they stand in the slowly melting slush and snow slurry and see pine needles clustered there. And remember that it wasn't very long ago that the streets were decked out with discarded Christmas trees for the council to collect. We are still in the thick of it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I do believe in a bit of suffering to make the joy all the sweeter. I like to think of this stage as the proving stage of the wonderful fresh baked loaf that is summer. And I'm going to use a lot of baking analogies over the next few podcasts because we're making lots of bread. Kat has been given some yeast, some alive yeast from Slovakia by her brother. And it lives in the fridge now and gets tended to and fed like a sloppy, bubbling Tamagotchi. But this is not the bread-making podcast. This is the gardening podcast. So let's just say that we're in that proving stage. We are getting fluffier and fatter as the winter goes on, and then we will emerge smelling wonderful in the spring air. This week I was planting. I did a little bit of planting. It was repair planting rather than master plan planting. And I really had to compromise on the scheme. I'll tell you about it. So we've had the landscapers in, as we very often do, because there's a lot of work to do in the hard landscaping areas, as well as the soft landscaping areas of the garden. And these guys have been laying a path, and they've been laying it next to an area of lawn that I reseeded in the autumn, and I talked about on the podcast. And these are very, very good landscapers, very talented, very respectful landscapers, but heaving around vast slabs of York stone and then laying them and pointing them is messy work and invariably involves damage to the plants around, and particularly to very tiny little grass seedlings. And also laying a path, it's not just the path that goes down. That's what we think. That's what us who are not part of the concrete brethren think. But those in the know, those of the cement mixer, know that you need to put all sorts of scalpings and hardcore down. And then when you lay the path, you have to have haunchings. You have to have those sloping shoulder bits of the path that go out under the surrounding ground and stop the whole thing sliding away like the crust on a lava flow. The upshot of which is the lawn has been rather beaten up and has a vast trench lying down one side of it. Now, this is not the time of year to be reseeding because germinations can be very, very low. We might get a good mild week, and grass seed will germinate in Britain in January, but you don't really want to do it. I know it's nice to feed the birds and all, but I'd rather not. So, and turfing likewise. You can turf all winter long. Turf to your heart's content as long as the ground's not actually frozen. But because this lawn was seeded in the main, to have a strip of turf down one side would look distinctly idiotic. It would look like a gentleman who can grow the most magnificent moustache, but only a little peachy fuzz on the rest of his face. And I don't think that's what I want the garden to look like. So I decided that it'll probably will be reseeded at some point, but until then we'll do a temporary display. We'll do something winning and wowing for the eyes of spring. So I decided to put in just a load of bulbs in there. And on Monday I prepared the ground by bringing up lots of nice filtered compost to fill in the holes and make a lovely receptive bed for them. Because this was completely unplanned, there are no bulbs to go in that channel. The bulb order was processed in September. The bulbs are all planted in the autumn. So this trench was going to have to be filled with that most wasteful and galling and unnecessarily expensive product, which is the pre-sprouted bulb. The bulb that you go and you buy in a little plastic pot with a little bit of compost around it and a little green shoot coming out of it. It's galling, it's horrible to have to do it because you know how much extra you're paying for that pot that's just going to go into the bin and pollute the planet, and the bit of soil when you've got a whole garden of soil. You didn't need that, but c'est la vie, that's what's going to happen. I was thinking that this actually could be quite fun. It's quite a big area. It can slide out. It might be fun to play around with a bulb bedding display. Then I thought, actually, well, maybe I should get something that will naturalise. Then I can just sow grass seed around it. So something that is enough of a display to stand up on its own this year, but also features bulbs that can grow through low grass and will come back year on year. So not bedding tulips, essentially. This was one of those planting schemes where you almost see it before you plant it, which is very bad. It's not how you should do things, because you should actually plan your gardens around stock lists and availabilities and things you can plant. But with this brief I'd set myself, I immediately had a vision of a garden in March filled with little glory of the snow, with China doxa as a ground cover, those wonderful little star-shaped flowers with the whitish centre that can form a magnificent carpet, and then amongst that clumps of late flowering snowdrop and little creamy yellow daffodils in slightly sparser clumps, and I could see the whole thing with a little tree hanging over them. This was a problem because obviously I wasn't going to be able to get these plants. It's really, really hard to find decent late flowering snowdrops because everyone is obsessed with the early flowers. You can get them out in December, you can get them out at the end of November, and I think that's not when we need them. We need them. Well, firstly, we need them in February, which is when the main glut of them come out. But then it's quite nice to have those snowdrops. There's really lovely things. They go with everything, and to have them coming out at the same time as your China doxa, it's really hard to find vigorous cultivars of the snowdrops that will bulk up and do a good job like the classic Galanthus nivalis in that situation. I've made this complaint before to various people, and a couple of times I've been told, well, why don't you just use leucojum? And leucojum is that larger snowdrop relative. It's not actually a snowdrop. It's a lot taller, and it flowers later in March or April. And I don't like it. I don't like its leaf-to-flower ratio. I don't like its height. I don't like its straggliness. I want a classic snowdrop of classic snowdrop height and clump-forming ability and flower-to-leaf ratio. I just want one that comes out in February or March. And I know they exist. They go out. You can carry on flowering snowdrops until April if you really want to. So if anyone's got any recommendations for a good, vigorous snowdrop of that nature, just a cultivar of Galanthus nivalis or a plicatus form, something like that does well. Anyway, that was in my head, and stupidly I went home thinking about it, and then on Tuesday went out to see what I could find in the limited selection of things pre-grown for you by nurseries. And I have to say the selection's awful because anyone sensible has bought their bulbs from a catalogue. So unfortunately, I was dealing with a limited supply, but I found lots of China Doxa luciliae, which is a slightly larger formed variety, but very, very common, and that should be able to hold its own. And then the daffodils that they sell are almost exclusively dwarf daffodils. I think that's probably just reasons of logistics. It's so much easier to deal with a dwarf daffodil than a 40-centimetre tall Carlton that's toppling over, top heavy, getting in the way, getting its leaves squashed. If you have a little tete-a-tete, you can sell it to anyone, and it'll behave itself, and it will balance properly on a table in a garden centre. So there's lots of that, lots of Jetfire, which is a daffodil I really don't like. It's another one of the ones with the recursive petals, and it has a bright orange bill, almost like you'd find on a particularly loud and extravagant duck, and then bright classic daffodil yellow petals. And for some reason, even though it's very cheerful, I don't like it. I managed to find some Huera, which is that tall, elegant, slightly scented daffodil with the recursive petals that you often grow as a container plant for the scent. And I managed to find some Narcissus Jack Snipe, which is another of the dwarf daffodils. And it's like Jetfire in the fact that it's bicolor. It's got the recursive petals, but they're in a creamy yellow, almost white. And its corona, its beak or bill, is more yellow. So it's less jarring for the eye. And those will go along with the China Doxa fairly well. I bought loads of China Doxa. It's a plant that doesn't do well as an individual thing come up from the bulb. It needs phalanxes of friends. It needs a whole army around it. When you put any order in for China Doxa, and I suggest you do it in the autumn, then double it or triple it or quadruple it. You really, really want to do this one en masse. And those planting distances, they say, plant them 10 centimetres apart, half them, quarter them, plant them almost next to each other. I got those all in, and then underneath them, for a bit of extravagant summer flair, I put in about 250 Crocosmia corms, and hopefully those are just going to go exploding out after the spring flowering bulbs, and then we'll have a wave of red and green. As I was planting these things on Tuesday afternoon, the sky got ominously dark. It clouded over, and slushy bits of sleet started to fall down the back of my neck. And I thought to myself, well, lucky this isn't going to settle, because then I won't be able to get off the top of this hill. And then, like in a nightmare, like when you think something and it makes it so, it started to snow heavily. That really good, big, wafty fat flakes, like someone has burst a quite expensive pillow up in the sky. And then it was a race to get the Crocosmia corms in before it was impossible for me to get home. The Crocosmia corms I was worried about because they're not really hardy enough to be left on the top of the soil under a load of snow that's then going to freeze solid. I don't mind if a daffodil pot freezes absolutely solid. You can still plant it and be fine. But these Crocosmias I needed to get in. So worked really, really hard, and the snow came down, and then ended up sprinting around to put all the tools away, just throwing them into corners. Stupidly, I'd driven the day. Normally I cycle, and it's easy to just sort of skid downhill on a bicycle and go onto a train. But cars get stuck and people abandon them, and there were people sliding into curbs, and I was bouncing around the place and just managed to get out, the last man out of the Chilterns, and down into London and comparative safety. That was Tuesday. Wednesday was a snow day. Nothing to learn from that. On Thursday I was off doing some garden history work. We're talking about garden buildings, which was very nice. Talking about temples and follies, not about sheds, nothing so utilitarian. though we did gently touch on some of those wonderfully disguised things, where you disguise your dairy as a chapel, or you disguise your cow shelter as a crenellated castle, like they do at Rousham. It made me think that we should take more risks and be more playful in our gardens. I know that taste is everything, but sometimes I think that the taste has conquered a little bit too much and that we have lost a little bit of extravagance. On Friday, I got stuck into some more core horticultural activities. I was pruning a nice climbing rose. Now, this wasn't one of those extreme renovation prunes where you take a gnarled old thing and instantly snip away 30 years of wood and thorn and rejuvenate it. This was quite a young plant. I think it's probably been planted about 3 years ago and then been horrendously mistreated since. First, it was tied to a trellis, which itself was screwed onto the wall. And I think that's unnecessary for a climbing rose. I think that they look better just on the wall. A wooden trellis is not really needed on a brick wall. So I took the trellis off and laid the rose out in its tangled mass. I don't know exactly what rose it is because it was planted before I arrived, but it's got a blushish pink flower. It feels like a Shropshire lad or something along those lines. And seeing it there was very sad because it's been slightly mismanaged and it's got all sorts of weird bits of wire and sandwich ties sticking out from it. It looked like something that you might see on an RSPB, Save the Birds advert, something washed up on a beach, all tangled in plastic bags and twine. So I snipped off all of the bindings that had snarled it up and had a look at it and chose 5 or so good, long, fresh new bits of growth to be my structural branches and chopped everything else off. And those 5 I then fixed back onto the wall. And I know that the RHS Gospel on pruning climbing roses suggests using wires, horizontal wires, each 18 inches apart, and spreading it out almost in an espalier form. But I don't like to do that to roses because I don't like a strict espalier shape for a climbing rose. I don't think it's necessary. They've got so much give and bend in the branches. I like to see that on the structure. I like to see something that looks almost more like the decorations you might see in some Islamic tiling on the Alhambra. Something with a curve to it. Still some symmetry there from the two sides, but with curves and different shapes. So what I did was I put in some nails into the wall. You can't be shy about this. You can't just use existing bits that are hanging out of the wall. If you want to do this, you need to be confident and put new little nails in the wall where you want to make your ties. And then I spread the rose out into almost like a fleur-de-lis sort of shape. One of those things where you get one going straight up and then curving side branches, except you only get 2 side branches on a fleur-de-lis, and I had 5 branches, so 2 curling ones on each side and one that goes up a bit straight. And hopefully that pattern I'll continue, that from those curving branches the rose will want to shoot up from the top of that curve, and then that next one will get curved down, and there'll be other ones coming up, and we'll get almost a fish scale pattern hopefully across the wall. It's very exciting. It's such a wonderful job doing something like that because you get to stand back at the end of it. And what was such a directionless tangle, a depressing thing tucked behind a drain pipe to keep it up, suddenly looks like it has dreams, it has ambitions, it wants to flower, it wants to look good for you. This rose has a twin, which I will do on Monday. I'm quite looking forward to that. The day didn't finish with the glow of rose pruning. The day finished by going out and repairing some local verges that delivery trucks, digging trucks, soil moving trucks on their way to and fro from the garden had managed to smash and ruin. So I went out and did a little bit of repair, scraped some of the mud off the road. For the life of a gardener is nothing if not varied. It was a good week, full of jobs, interesting jobs. It's amazing, this should be the deadest part of the year, But there is so much going on, so much variety, so much to see. So many lengthening catkins and pointy-nosed bulb shoots. I do think the snowdrops are very good this year. I think they've benefited probably from that hot summer. Snowdrops I think of them as quite wet plants, but they're really not. They like a nice dry summer once they've done their leaf and flower thing. There's a couple of wonderful old graveyards that I sometimes pass with these majestic drifts of snowdrops around the ancient crooked graves. I don't think there's a better pairing. I know that yew trees and ravens are the traditional accessories for our funerary items, but I think snowdrops and gravestones, perfect. So that's a little tip for any of you who are already thinking about how you would like to design your final resting place. Get going now, because they do take quite a while to bulk up snowdrops. You don't want to be buried in a plot that just has snowdrops in their first year, where they come up with that single leaf and the single flower, and you think, how are you ever going to be an awe-inspiring clump? Get them going now if you've got a particular grove that you find yourself yearning to be buried in. Anyway, that's enough morbidity. Let's see if we have any recommendations this week. Here is a wonderful recommendation for you, and for me actually, because I was not aware of this until today. I was on social media doing something to do with plants, and someone mentioned that all of the lectures from last year's Beth Chatto Symposium are available online for free. And I didn't know that. I remember it happened last August, and I didn't go, and they had the most amazing collection of speakers. Everyone who is everyone in the wonderful world of ecological gardening, the right plant, right place, Beth Chatto style of doing things, was there talking about their life's work, passionately enthusing about things. And I saw various stories about this and thought, damn, I missed out there. But all of these things now have been put up online, and the slides go with them, so you can watch the video and see the slides as Oliver Felipe talks you through the Mediterranean landscapes as inspiration for planting design. That's one of the lectures. Or as Cassian Schmidt from that wonderful garden out in Germany, the Hermannshof Garden. These are really, really well-respected people, the best in the world, all gathered together to talk about these things. So I really recommend you to go and have a look at that. I'll do that. There must be 12, 15 hours worth of content there, and each minute will be worth paying attention to. So if you do find yourself with any free time, I know we have discussed that the winter is not the great period of relaxation that sometimes non-gardeners think it is. But if you do have any spare time, then I really recommend you go and have a look at that. That's at bethchattosymposium.com, and then you just go to recorded lectures. They also have some wonderful looking pictures from the event itself to make you feel jealous and to encourage you to go next year. It's certainly working well on me. Right, well, I'll let you get on. I'm sure you've got fig pruning or rose tying to get on with. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you to everyone who got in touch with me this week, either via email or on the Facebook group. That's the Garden Log Podcast Facebook group, and said how much they've been enjoying things. I do appreciate hearing from the listeners. It's lovely. You can find me at Ben's Garden on Twitter, or at Gardenerdark on Instagram, or you can email me at thegardenlogpodcast@gmail.com. Next week I hope to be rose pruning again, maybe a little bit more work with the apples, and the rest of it depends on the weather. There's some bits and pieces I'd like to do with lawns and grass, but that is all in the lap of the gods. I'll probably end up doing something wildly different. Thank you very, very much for listening. I hope you all have a wonderful week, whether you are in the garden or not, and I will see you all again here next week for episode 52 of The Garden Log. Thank you very much, and goodbye.